Story 1. A bit of background. I used to live in a set of 2-room apartments, important, that covered roughly a block and all faced forwards. Also important, this ungrateful woman, Karen, who had moved there from a much worse country. When she got there she had nothing, and I mean nothing. Her kids would sleep on the floor. They had no fridge, food, nothing. All I could name is possible. Some kitchenware and blankets to sleep on the floor with. So between some neighbors we were able to help her with basic things, food, leftovers, blankets, and even a neighbor lent them clothes. And soon enough I'm not sure what got into her. She became a whole witch, not returning lent items such as our Blu-ray player along with the movies, because she didn't have it. Oh well. Now about her kids. Oh my God. These little kids were disrespectful, entitled, and just not good company at all. So most neighbors cut contact with them. After a while her younger sister, 24-ish, moved in and brought her identically horrible kids, except she had 4. Well, cue the constant bickering, arguments, and almost physical fights then started to occur when the older sister moved out, and she felt like she had all the power when in reality she was in the same situation her older sister was in, except nobody even came in contact with her. Within the first month of the roughly 3-year span we had with her, we already had huge issues. Music at 5 in the morning, close fights, arguments, her destroying our property, rock path we had. And not too long ago, both of our cars' front and rear mirrors were shattered. And worst of all, one of her kids bullied my little sister in school to the point where she almost threw her off a playground. I was over it. I had to do something. The plan. For the longest time I was just plotting, and on multiple occasions when her kids, all under 11 at the time, would curse at me or insult me, I would return it, very casually. Insult me, smile and cover my mouth and pretend to be in distress. Screw you too, with a kind smile, or a casual get lost. Keep in mind these kids would insult their own mother like this constantly and get into verbal and physical fights all the time. But she had the audacity to come outside and tell me, "You're too old to be arguing with children." And I would simply say something along the lines of, "And they are too young to be talking like that to anybody," and I would simply tell her to get lost and get out of my ear, while my mom just laughed. She was the kind of person to talk down on somebody for their car. We have a early 2000s car law, talk bad about their living space, while she had no way of transport, lived in a bad place, and just lacked self-awareness like an insufferable person would, and nobody liked her. Even her father had enough of her antics. He lived in the same complex and got along with my mother quite well, oddly enough. The revenge. I wanted to see her suffer for what she did to my family, and what better way than to record all the abusive behavior she displayed with her children. So I voice recorded anything I possibly could. And then one day I gathered enough evidence and called CPS on concerns that I felt like something wasn't right, and that I felt like the kids were in danger. And within a few days the word got around quickly that CPS took her children and put them in custody of the father and mother, as she clearly was not suited as a mother. Apparently her kids would get into physical fights with her and each other and had the bruises and cuts to prove it. I thought I'd post this here as a few days ago, we went to visit a friend living there, and we were pleasantly surprised that she is no longer living there. Story 2. So, I'm a 16-year-old girl, and I've been dating my 17-year-old boyfriend for about 8 months now. To give some background, he's incredibly family-oriented, which is fine, but it's pretty different from how I was raised. I grew up in the deep south of Georgia with very conservative parents who ran a strict household. They raised me to be independent and self-reliant, so I wouldn't need to rely on them as much when I got older. My boyfriend, on the other hand, was brought up in a much more lenient and close-knit family environment. He can't even recall the last time he got in trouble or had his phone taken away, and he was never spanked. His bond with his family is something I've never encountered before, not even in other families. We've had our share of issues, especially emotionally and in terms of boundaries. For instance, he doesn't express much emotion when I'm upset. And there was one incident where I think he attempted to cross a boundary without my consent, which really affected me. That aside, he's a good person at heart. My parents, however, struggle to like him because of how different he is from what they're used to. One thing I've noticed is that I often pay for nearly everything when we go out meals. His gas money to visit me, I live 45 minutes away, and other little expenses. I'm not sure if this is normal, but it does bother me. On top of all that, there's an issue with his family's dog, a pit bull that's about 3 or 4 years old. This dog has spent its entire life in a tiny, metal-fenced enclosure and is completely unsocialized. It's never had interactions with anyone or anything outside of my boyfriend and his family. To make matters worse, the last time the dog escaped, it attacked and killed their pet cat. Despite this, they recently decided to bring the dog inside as a house pet. When I heard about the change, I was immediately concerned. On Friday, I decided to stay over at my boyfriend's house, and they had the dog locked in the bathroom. But while I was hanging out in my boyfriend's room, they decided to let the dog out. The moment it got loose, it bolted straight into my boyfriend's room, jumped on the bed where I was sitting, and started sniffing me. I froze. Then, out of nowhere, it started growling, snarling, and barking in my face. Terrified, I instinctively covered my face with my elbow because I was convinced it was about to bite me. My boyfriend managed to pull the dog away, but he did it so gently that it slipped out of his grasp and lunged at me again. Luckily, he grabbed it before it could reach me, took it outside, and locked it out. After that, he just stared at me while I was sitting there crying, completely shaken. I leaned on his shoulder, trying to process what had just happened, but he didn't comfort me at all. Instead, he asked in an annoyed tone, "Let me guess, you're never going to come here again after this, are you?" I told him I wanted to go home because I didn't feel safe, and that made him angry. I ended up calling my grandfather to come get me because I knew my dad would have been furious if I told him what happened. As I was leaving, his parents decided it would be a great idea to bring the dog out on a leash while I was walking to my grandfather's car. The dog was barking and lunging at me, and instead of helping the situation, they were laughing and giggling. I was so scared that I had to run to the car. They didn't apologize or even acknowledge how terrifying the situation was for me. This turned into a larger issue over the next few days because I felt I deserved an apology for what happened. My boyfriend eventually told his dad that I was upset and asked him to apologize. The dad messaged me on Facebook, but instead of apologizing, he accused me of being dramatic. He claimed that if the dog was truly aggressive, it would still be outside in its cage, implying I had made the whole thing up. To make matters worse, my boyfriend told them that my dad was angry about the situation, and their response was to cut contact with my dad completely. That was incredibly frustrating because my dad had every right to be upset. Instead of addressing the issue, they used this moment to take jabs at me. His parents told my boyfriend that they always thought I was strange and didn't like how I never talked or ate his mom's food. What they didn't know or care to ask about is that I have severe social anxiety and take medication that makes me feel nauseous when I eat. Then, things got even more hurtful. His mom called me a gold digger and claimed our relationship was one-sided. That comment really hit a nerve because, aside from our first date, my boyfriend has never paid for a single meal. I cover the cost of our food almost every time and even give him gas money when he comes to visit me. So, her accusation couldn't have been further from the truth. After all this, my boyfriend's dad doubled down and said he didn't care what happened between me and my boyfriend. He dismissed my feelings entirely, saying I had blown everything out of proportion and that the situation wasn't that deep. His mom has also never liked me or made any effort to talk to me, and now it feels like she's doing everything she can to make me look bad. There's so much more to this story, but it's exhausting to even think about it. I just feel completely unsupported by my boyfriend and disrespected by his family. Am I wrong for feeling this way? One last thing I should mention is that his mom has made it pretty clear she thinks her son can do better than me. She acts superior and has even insulted my dogs, which are purebred working dogs with champion bloodlines. Meanwhile, her own dogs include an aggressive pit bull and a stray mutt she found on the side of the road. It's frustrating to deal with someone who looks down on me while failing to acknowledge her own flaws. At this point, I just feel like I need someone to tell me if I'm in the wrong here or if my feelings are valid. Story 3. I was working at Toys for Tots in the DC area, which is a program the Marine Corps runs every year to gather toys and gifts and distribute them to kids whose Christmas tree would likely disappoint Charlie Brown. Sexist or no, they seem to pick those of us who have the Marine look, in the casting sense. Tall, masculine, etc., or, on the ladies' side, that peculiar blend of, I'll beat you up with one hand while doing my eyeliner with the other. It's as much marketing as anything, especially in the DMV. Point being, we're a bunch of tall, very fit yucks out there in dress blues, smiling and coaxing toys out of people who could have probably saved Toys R Us with petty stock earnings. We look nothing like waitstaff. Myself, 6'1", 210 pounds, and my fellow Marine, 5'4", probably 135 pounds, were assigned to an event at the Smithsonian. Somehow the Corps had managed to get a display and a few donation bins put up at a black tie, invitation-only shindig surrounding the display of the Hope Diamond and a bunch of other large hunks of carbon. Personally, I don't understand the obsession with it. It's a large, shiny rock. No one is wearing it. It serves no scientific purpose, and it just sits there so you can look at it, or something. I feel more satisfaction looking at an exceptionally big turd the night after Taco Tuesday. At least I made it myself, often with significant effort, and no small amount of regret or self-loathing to provide fuel for the push. Anyway, we're smiling our pearly whites while the various movers and doers shake our hands, toys on display, posing for the cameras so their constituents, stockholders, etc. can see how kind-hearted they are. The sick thing is how many don't even donate. They just get a photo in front of the pile of toys, sans the generosity, pretty much par for the course. The initial wave of donations passes as the event gets down to business. Drinks are passed out, and they start in with the hors d'oeuvres. We're standing there surreptitiously munching and trying not to get those white gloves dirty, when this lady who's best described as a chubby mixed-race, female Steve Buscemi comes toddling up in a dress, waistcoat thing that looked like it was screaming for mercy from the Button Ferry. Fat Steve, hey you too, I'm dry here, let's get snappy with a refill. Or something like that. We didn't realize she was talking to us, so I only half paid attention. After a second of us not replying, she continued screaming, "Hey, I know you hear me. Get in gear, flirting time is over." At this point, we realize she meant us. I look over at Pocket, my fellow Marine's nickname. She looks at me. We look at the lady. It took a second, okay? Finally, I speak. "Me? Can I help you, ma'am?" "About time. I need a refill. And while you're at it, get me some of those some random munchy things. They stopped bringing them out a few minutes ago. You guys really?" Pocket. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we don't work here. We're just here with the toys. I don't care what you think. Get in gear, or I'll have your job. I'll not be talked to by someone like you." She proceeds to toss her empty-ish glass at Pocket, who gets some leftover drips on her blues, but catches it out of reflex. I can see the thunderclouds gathering. A stain like that likely means she's likely looking at a new blues coat, which runs a few $100s. Probably a new ribbon setup too. Pocket is Puerto Rican and has the temper to match, so I try to head the lady off. Me. "Ma'am, we're not waitstaff, we're just..." "I don't want to hear your excuses. Do you know who my husband is?" She proceeded to put her finger right under my nose and continue the tirade. Apparently, hubby was a Southern senator's main booster/campaign funder, so said Google, and would see to it I'd be sleeping under newspaper and etc. After about 10 odd seconds of this, we started to draw stairs and some of the staff were starting to head our way. However much I wanted to put this witch in a compliance hold, I could pretty well visualize the CNN article if a male Marine laid hands on a woman in front of all those people, especially a politically connected one. I was sort of at a loss. Fortunately, for me, I didn't have to make that choice. Pocket made it for me. "Ma'am, You need to calm down. Please take your glass and—" She held out the woman's glass to her as she said this. The woman immediately switches her wrath from me to Pocket and slaps the glass out of Pocket's hands. I could see Pocket's control wavering, but there wasn't anything for it. Fat Steve bored right in. The critical mistake was to start jabbing Pocket with her finger, right in the chest, with each word, "You shut your spick mouth." I cringed visibly at that second-to-last word, because I knew exactly what was about to happen. And it did. It's called the You'd Got 'em in judo, basically a standing arm lock, and Pocket was a 2-tab black belt. Pocket snatched her arm up, locked her out, and slammed her face straight into the wall next to us. Blood, broken nose, drywall dust, the whole bit. Pocket didn't even say anything, just that grim teeth smile that says, "I'm going to screw you up so hard your grandkids will be born with my handprints on their soul." It was awesome, and a little hot to be honest. I, being both the senior Marine and somewhat cooler of temperament, carefully pulled Pocket back. I dare say it was akin to handling a small but very dangerous animal. Fat Steve kind of slides to the floor, actually much quieter now that she's trying to aspirate a mixture of blood and gypsum. Security finally showed up to help, which resulted in them hauling the woman away and taking us to a separate room, where we gave our version of things. Security recordings were reviewed, of which there were many, what with the fancy rocks everywhere, and so on. Pocket wanted to press assault charges. I called the head shed to let them know what happened. They sent a van to pick us toys up. Funny enough, it never seemed to make it to the news. I think that, more than anything, saved Pocket. Upon coming back to the main event area to load the toys and take down the display, we were given a wide berth by many of the upper crusties. I feel compelled to mention the notable exception. This one old lady who came up and asked if she could give Pocket a hug, of all things. Just kinda gave her that grandma-style hug, patted her on the back and took her hands. You know, in my younger years, I would have stomped that whale flat. "Wonderfully done, dear," and then wandered off to rejoin the party. It was adorable. Story 4. Let me start with some backstory. I work at a large grocery store chain as a stocker. My job includes replenishing shelves, replacing items that customers left behind or returned, and other chores around the store. It's a relatively small store, so most of us employees are trained to handle almost all the tasks. On this particular evening, I was putting away a cart of items that customers had decided they didn't want or that were damaged. There's a separate area where damaged items are placed, obviously. I should explain that I am deaf. While I'm not completely without hearing, I can faintly pick up certain loud sounds like slamming doors or ringing phones. However, I cannot hear voices, not even yelling. I communicate through sign language, and I always wear a large pin and a lanyard that clearly say I am deaf. Additionally, I carry a small notebook with pre-written responses to common questions, like flashcards, to help communicate when needed. Though it's sometimes challenging, most people are patient, and we figure out a way to communicate. Some kind people even use sign language, which always brightens my day. Since I'm pretty young and don't fit the typical stereotype of a hearing-impaired person, people sometimes get a little irritated at first when I don't respond immediately. However, they're usually very apologetic once they realize I'm deaf. Not this time. This is where the story takes a turn. Now, here's the cast of characters for context. Me, the deaf teenager. Crazy Karen CK, the unreasonable customer. Nice customer NC, the helpful bystander. Store manager M1, my direct manager. Regional or district manager M2, the higher-up manager. It all started on an evening when I decided to get an early start on putting away the overstock from the day. This was earlier than my usual routine, so the store was busier than it typically is when I do this task. No big deal, I went ahead anyway. About halfway through my cart, I was in the paper towels aisle when I suddenly felt someone roughly poke my shoulder. Startled, I jumped and turned around to see a woman standing there. She was taller than me, and I'm not exactly short, I'm 6 feet tall. She was very thin, probably in her mid-50s, with frizzy blonde hair held back by a bright red hat that supported the former United States President, Donald Trump. For context, this was back in September 2020. She wasn't wearing a face mask, even though it was still required at the time. Judging by her aggressive expression, she was yelling at me, though I couldn't hear what she was saying. I pointed to my lanyard and my ears, trying to communicate that I couldn't hear her. Later, the nice customer told me what she had been yelling, things like, "I'm talking to you," and "I've been trying to get your attention for 5 minutes." She suddenly stepped forward, grabbed my lanyard, yanked it off my neck, and threw it on the ground. I was shocked, and panic started setting in. I tried to say out loud that I couldn't hear her, but since I've never heard my own voice, I wasn't sure how it came out. My significant other says it sounds cute, for what it's worth. At this point, the nice customer entered the picture. A man in his 30s came around the corner, saw what was happening, and approached us. He asked the woman what the problem was. Later, he wrote down for me what was said. He tried to defend me, saying, "Can't you see he's deaf? Why are you yelling at a kid like that?" The woman replied with something like, "He's not deaf, he's just ignoring me because he's lazy." Their argument escalated while I stood there, completely overwhelmed. A crowd started to form, and I couldn't stop the tears from running down my face. Thankfully, my 2 managers arrived at the scene. My direct manager, M1, walked over to me, while M2 went to handle the commotion between the woman and the nice customer, who were now full-on shouting at each other. M1 knows sign language, so she asked if I was okay. I nodded, though I was still shaken. She told me to grab my things and wait for her in the employee break room. I picked up my lanyard from the ground and did as she instructed. About 15 minutes later, M1 and M2 came into the break room with a police officer. To my surprise, the woman had been arrested for third-degree assault. M1 explained to me in sign language that the officer needed a written statement and asked if I wanted to press charges. Without hesitation, I said yes. I wrote down my statement, and the officer took it. The nice customer stayed to make sure I was okay. I wrote him a thank you note, and M1 even gave him a gift card for being such a helpful and kind person. As for the woman, she was sentenced to a few months in jail, put on probation, and fined a significant amount. I'll admit, I felt a sense of justice, knowing there were consequences for her actions. Though this was by far the worst experience I've ever had with a customer, I'm so grateful for people like M1, M2, and the nice customer who stood up for me. Their kindness reminded me that there's still good in the world, even on tough days. Story 5. I was reminiscing with my family about my late grandfather and some of the tomfoolery he got up to. I thought this story made a perfect post for this sub. Backstory. Decades ago, my grandparents purchased a large plot of land out in the middle of nowhere with the idea to build themselves a home and retire on that plot. They were both from the rural Midwest, so they originally wanted to keep horses, chickens, and maybe a few other small farm animals on this land, hence the size. As the years went by and they started actually making plans, they realized that horses weren't really feasible for a variety of reasons. By that time, the area around their plot of land had been significantly more developed, so they instead split the plot into 8 pieces and sold the other 7, essentially financing their original purchase and the construction of the house, leaving their retirement and pension untouched. Because of their incredibly advantageous position, they made a point to only sell to like-minded buyers, friendly retirees who were looking for their last home and wanted a bit of the same rural isolation that my grandparents wanted. The result is that my grandparents ended up with their dream bungalow on a spacious lot surrounded by friendly neighbors, and without any major time or money obligations. They ended up spending a lot of time volunteering and generally making friends with the community that was growing around them. The event? The area ended up becoming incorporated, and the town they were now living in eventually decided that the 2-lane blacktop road needed to be repaved and upgraded with sidewalks, gutters, and all the other amenities townspeople expect. Now the county that the town was incorporated from had planned ahead, and there was plenty of room set aside for exactly this type of project. so none of the residents needed to move their fences or give up property to the state. However, most of them had placed their mailboxes on a post about a half-dozen feet from their property line nearer to the road, so that the postman had easy access. When the construction started, a city representative visited each property on this street and gave them a heads-up on what to expect, and also asked that the residents move their mailboxes to make room for construction. My grandfather, being of light schedule and helpful demeanor, offered to help his neighbors temporarily relocate their mailbox and post. He had retired from a career as a handyman, and several of his children owned landscaping or similar businesses. So he and my uncle spent a few hours with a mini backhoe and unearthed all 8 of his neighbors' mailbox posts, cement and all. He saved the post to reinstall when the road was complete, and mounted the mailbox proper on each property's fence. The issue. Lo and behold, on Monday they had no mail service. After a bit of investigation, they realized none of their neighbors did either. So the next morning my grandfather waited outside to see what the problem was. Right on time, the mailman drove down their side of the street, completely ignoring all 8 properties. Redoubling his efforts, the next morning my grandfather was able to flag the mailman down and ask what the problem was. According to my grandfather, the very dry response was, "I'm not required to deliver to any mailbox more than 36 inches from the edge of the road." A call to the Postal Service confirmed this rule. The mailmen may deliver outside that limit if they want, but they are not required to. The compliance. Now it's pretty amazing what you can get done with 8 business hours of free time. The problem was that 36 inches from the current edge of the road is in the way of construction. My grandfather spoke to the construction supervisor, who was sympathetic, but just as stuck as my grandfather was. My grandfather then visited the postal office and returned with a current copy of the regulations about mailbox locations. After a few hours of study and another visit to the construction supervisor's office with a half-dozen donuts and some coffee, he had formulated a plan. Remember his sons who ran landscaping businesses? My grandfather got in his truck and visited both businesses. He returned home with 8 20-gallon plant pots. These things are huge, 30 inches tall and just about as large around. You see, while the construction guys couldn't mess with a federally protected, fixed mailbox, they were happy to move a pot out of their way in the morning. And back when the job was finished for the day, my grandma makes some pretty good donuts, which is a pretty easy task when you have earth-moving equipment nearby. So each post was replanted in a 20-gallon pot, and each mailbox was remounted on a post, and each pot was placed conservatively within 36 inches of the current road's edge. The kicker was that a mailbox post that is meant to stick 4 feet out of the ground has at least 2 feet buried in the ground. In other words, it's a 6-foot post. When you put that inside a pot with a few inches of soil underneath, and that pot on the surface of the ground, a mailbox on top is easily more than 6 feet in the air. You see, the mailbox codes clearly specify how far horizontally a mailbox needs to be from the road, but say nothing about how high that mailbox needs to be. It took a few more conversations with the postman and a visit from the local inspector, but the mailman spent the better part of 6 months delivering to 8 mailboxes 6 feet in the air rather than walk the extra 6 feet to the fence. Story 6. Hi, I'm Crack Elf, and I have a service dog for my seizures. Before I recount the tale of this humanoid embodiment of a wet fart, I need to say a handful of things about service dogs. In the US, there is no legit or legal certification or registration for service dogs. There is no paperwork or certificate. There is no set harness or vest that makes a service dog real, and service dogs aren't even required to wear anything identifying them. For a dog to be a service dog, you must be disabled. The dog must be trained to do work to help with the disability. Snuggling or, "he makes me feel better by being around" do not count, and the dog must not have any kind of bite record. The dog also has to be trained to handle being in public. I went to the X Mall with my service dog and ended up going into a home decor shop. She was wearing a Harry Potter-themed vest, Slytherin pattern fabric, but was marked clearly as a service dog. She was sitting in a close heel. I suddenly heard loud, angry, excitable barking, and it sounded like it was coming from a big dog. My service dog had been attacked before, so I was kind of freaked already. I was looking to see if there was a second exit to the shop when I saw the older woman with her severely obese, hyperactive Labrador and wildly overstimulated child in tow. The lab was pulling at the end of his flexi lead, barking his head off, and it looked like his tiny red vest was either going to snap or cut through his fat rolls. She had the flexi lead attached to his vest, and he wasn't wearing a collar. We're in sort of a weird standoff, where I look like I'm one minor inconvenience away from a heart attack, and she's smirking, letting her dog bark, pull, and fling saliva everywhere. The thing was acting like Cujo, bird dog edition. The entitled mother gets her son's attention by snapping a few times and then pointing at my dog and says, as loud as she possibly can, "See? That's a fake support dog. The real ones are always retrievers." I wasn't really sure what to say to that, because she's wrong and her service dog is currently running in place at the end of its lead because it can't get any traction on the floor. I couldn't get past her because the little corridor to the exit was narrow enough for Cujo 2.0 to get a hold of my service dog. I settled on, "Move, I can't get past your dog." She immediately starts getting pissy and claiming that my wolf hybrid, husky, but okay, is actually vicious and her dog only wants to play. I just sort of told her to move again. She started yelling for an employee, claiming she felt she was in danger and they needed to kick me out with my fake service dog, because said dog, who was standing directly beside me, completely silent, was a direct threat to her psychotic lab. An employee who looks as if he gave up on happiness at the ripe old age of 15. "God, dude, I'm sorry you have to deal with this kind of person regularly," comes over and glances at me, then turns his attention to the entitled mother. This convo followed. "Employee, your dog is barking and not under control. Please leave. You can come back without him. Legal to request and enforce if the dog is acting like that." Entitled mother: "Excuse me? Are you trying to deny me service because my son has an autism support dog?" She said that over the dog barking itself hoarse. According to the Americans with Disabilities Act, employees can ask people with disruptive or aggressive dogs to leave. You can still return without him. "My son needs this dog. He can't leave the house without this dog." She whips out her phone, starting to dial 911. I'm still just looking for a way to get out of the store. On the phone with the 911 dispatcher, crying, screaming about how her son is being discriminated against because he has a service dog, getting more and more frustrated because the dispatcher is taking maybe a second too long. She demands that the dispatcher send the emergency medical services and police. Her son starts to cry because his loud and angry mom is probably terrifying for him. There is a short lull when her dog suddenly stops barking, sniffs the ground, and starts circling. He then pops a squat right in the Pottery Barn entryway and drops an almost liquid turd so foul that it could curl a lumberjack's eyelashes. The employee sighs and tells her again to just leave, but not to come back. She resumes screaming. I zone out of reality and into the Wii Sports theme because I'm trapped in the store, not only by a possibly aggressive dog, but also by the river of molten dog poop spread out in the entryway. Police and the emergency medical services arrive. They start asking the three of us some questions. Employee and I are understandably losing the will to live, and the entitled mother is screaming and gesturing wildly, yanking her crying kid's arm around in the process. The cop turns to the employee and says, "Which dog made that mess?" Employee tells him the truth. It was the entitled mother's dog. The entitled mother starts screaming about how this is discrimination against her autistic son. The cop asks what task the dog performs, legal, and she says, emotional support. The cop, of course, tells her to leave because emotional support animals don't have public access rights. She suddenly interrupts the cop and says that the dog is actually for her fainting episodes and he barks when she is going to faint. Dog resumes barking, and she dramatically faints. "Reed," she said, "I'm fainting." and lowers herself to the ground, guarding her face, and then goes limp when she's on the floor. Everything is quiet for a moment, until the cop says, "Ma'am," and she yells, "Get the emergency medical services. I fainted. I am injured." I have fully left this plane of existence, and I am now watching in third person. The emergency medical services trundle over with a stretcher, which she limply rolls onto, making those weird fatigued Southern belle noises. Dog resumes barking. Son resumes crying. The EMS ask who is going to take the dog, because they are refusing to transport a possibly aggressive animal. The entitled mother resumes screaming about discrimination. She caves after they tell her she will not be going to the hospital until someone else has the dog. She yells for her husband for 2 minutes straight until he comes up, takes the barking dog, takes the kid, and leaves. She is shipped to the hospital and hopefully the psych ward. A janitor comes to clean up the river of liquid doo-doo in the entryway. Employee goes back to the usual drudgery of working at Pottery Barn, and I go home because my batteries are empty.